Unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everybody. So I think I've even talked to some of you about the topic that I was all set to talk about today. I've been planning it for weeks, but then Wednesday, there was an event that changed my mind about the topic. I needed to talk about it today, and that event was the death of Mel Brooks. So actually, I'm kind of emotional about this. Like, I don't know her personally, but I'm just so blown away by her. And she was just such an amazing person. So in case, I think most everybody has heard of bell hooks, but if you haven't, she was an academic, an author, a feminist, a cultural critic, and a Black woman, and also self-described queer. So she had a lot of things that she was dealing with. She was also a Buddhist, and so I thought it would be really important to talk about her in the context of Buddhism in the United States. So the name Bell Hooks is actually a pen name. Her actual given name is Gloria Jean Watkins, but most people know her by the name Bell Hooks. So just a little background on her. She was born in 1952 in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and this would have been a town that was highly segregated. She was one of 6 children, and her parents were working class. They both had jobs. When she was young, her father was a janitor, her mother was a maid. And then eventually her father he worked for the Postal Service, and her mother was able to stay home. The name Bell Hooks is actually the given name of her great-grandmother. So she actually, her earliest education in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, was in racially segregated schools. So even though by the time she got into kindergarten, would have been starting school, Brownlee Board of Education was already passed. Integration or desegregation of schools was underway, and it was unconstitutional to segregate schools, but Kentucky had a policy that was the go slow policy with regard to allowing Black children to attend school with white children. So it wasn't really until the 60s, well into the 60s, that she started to attend a desegregated school. So she had a lot to deal with. I mean, this would have been all new. School would have been either comfortable but without resources, with fewer resources, or very uncomfortable. But still, she was able to graduate from high school, and she went on to Stanford University. That is where she did her undergraduate work. She wrote about growing up in the book Bone Black Memories of Girlhood. This was about this desegregation. So she attended college at Stanford University and graduated in 1973 with a BA in English. And then she went on to attend the University of Wisconsin at Madison and completed her MA in English in 1976. In 1978, while she was working on her PhD, she published a small book of poetry that was called, you can get it some places. It was called And There We Wept. And that's where the first time she used that pen name, Bell Hooks. And to distinguish herself from her great-grandmother, she chose to use the pen name with no capitalization. So both of those names are lowercase b's, or lowercase b, lowercase h, sorry. And she did that, first of all, to distinguish herself, but also because she says that she didn't want people to think about who is the author of this thing. How important is that person? What she wants people to focus on in her works is always the content of what's being said. So she went on then, during this time also she was working on her first book, that was the first academic book, which actually turns out to be a really big deal, this book. So starting even when she was about 19 years old, she starts to work on the book, Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism. That was published in 1981. And it still is de rigueur curriculum for women's studies classes. And other classes too, I'm sure. So this book was really about the experiences of Black women throughout history. And by the way, I'm using the term Black women because that's the term that she uses. I don't know if that makes it okay or not okay, but I know there's a lot of dispute about how we should talk about it. So I'm just choosing to talk about it the way she talked about it. She talks a lot about the history of Black women under slavery. What happened? What is the background there? And then also after emancipation, what was the background there? And then she really gets into she calls out everyone in this book. So not just the Southern white supremacist slave owners, but she calls attention to the effects of sexism in the civil rights movement and patriarchal structure of the organizations in the civil rights movement. She drew attention to the racism and classism in the feminist movement. So the feminists are all thinking they're like doing this big deal and they're really, we're going to be equal. And she's like, what you want is to be the same as your husbands. You don't actually want equality for everyone. You don't actually want equality for all women. Which was, nailed it. Completely right. So she went on to talk about stereotypes and depictions of Black women in the media. And then just racism, sexism, and classism as integral parts of a capitalist democracy. So she's like, everyone gets called out. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's the things you don't even realize. That, she really talks a lot, and she's not really trying to blame and point fingers. And that's a big theme in her later writings too. That she's like, I need you to know about this. I need you to self-examine, because that will liberate you too, and all of us. And it really draws your attention to. If you can let it, it'll draw attention to the fact that, wow, you know, that is something that I really didn't even realize I was thinking. I'm really conditioned by this system too. So it's interesting that she really draws a lot of attention to you examining your own thought processes and where they came from. And if we're going to go forward with a future in this society, what's that going to look like? And how are we going to structure our thoughts accordingly? How can we reorganize our thinking? So that book was published in 1981, and that's something she started writing as an undergrad, like as a teenager. So she started writing this book. And of course, there's been all kinds of backlash about it. But she just kept on going. She just kept on going, despite that. She's like, yeah, what are you going to do, you know? So she completed her PhD in English at the University of California in Santa Cruz in 1983. And from there, she went on to teach at UC Santa Cruz, at San Francisco State University, at Yale, at Oberlin College, at City College of New York, and finally at, I'm not sure how to say it, Berea or College in Kentucky. She published absolutely prolifically. And I actually was not able to, and I know this is not a good excuse, maybe I didn't do enough research, but I wasn't able to find a complete list of everything that she's written. There's at least 40 books and hundreds of articles, and they, including 5 children's books. Which I remembered, it's funny because when my father used to sell books for a living, and he had this little section of, like, you know, diversity books. And one of the books in that section was this little children's book that I thought was the cutest thing. I was just couldn't believe how adorable it was. And the name of that book was Happy to be Nappy. And it was about, you know, Black children feeling beautiful, right? And I just thought it was the sweetest thing. Well, it turns out, bell hooks. Who else? Anyway, check it out. It's really good. So she just expressed herself in so many different ways and shared her thinking and knowledge and ability to think about this with so many people. And it's just really amazing. And she also really has emphasized, you know, she practices what she preaches, right? In that we need to be able to question our thoughts, and then we need to be able to act accordingly out in the world. So she, as I said, she was also a practitioner of both Buddhism and Christianity. But her experience with Buddhism began with poetry. So she, even as a teenager, she was really interested in the Greek poets, Jack Kerouac and Diane de Prima and Gary Snyder. So I wanted to just read sort of some passages from this book. She's got a chapter in this book. This book is Women Practicing Buddhism, the American Experience, and American Experiences. And she's got a chapter in this book called Moving Beyond Gender, and it's really good. And I thought I would just read some passages from it because there's in no way am I going to be able to say what she has to say as well as she says it. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but some good, real good words. Suffering led me to Buddhism. I was searching for a way to end the anguish of spirit engulfing me since childhood. Like many of us, I had the outer trappings of success, a bright young scholarship student academically excelling at Stanford University, while inwardly, I was in a constant state of emotional crisis. My inner life was full of turmoil. Growing up in a fundamentalist Christian home, I had been taught to believe in salvation, to trust in the redemptive power of divine grace to heal all suffering. Even though I prayed and prayed to be released from the emotional pain that caused me to despair, often leading me to contemplate suicide, my prayers were not answered. I was falling into an abyss of sorrow, a dark night of the soul, so overwhelming it was impossible to find a source of light, a way out. Ironically, my prayers for salvation were answered as I, clinging to the hope that there was some way out of suffering, found my way to Buddhism. At first, Buddhism for me was all about reading texts. Meditation was not as vital to me as studying and learning about Buddhism. A serendipitous meeting with Gary Snyder changed all of that. One of the few students chosen to have dinner with the poet before a Stanford reading, I declined attending since it meant that I would need to leave my work at the daycare center and rush to the dinner with no time to wash or change my clothes. Tending 2-year-olds, running around all day, I was both funky and exhausted at the end of the day. But the soul force within me stirred my longing to meet the poet, to talk to him, to be in his presence, and rightly pushed me past the inner parental voice from childhood that would only have allowed me to attend this meeting if I was clean and well-dressed. I arrived wearing a dirty pink dress over a pair of blue jeans, and Snyder welcomed me, this country girl smelling of hard work, who longed to be a poet, who longed to find a spiritual path. By the end of the evening of talk about poetry and poetry reading, intense discussions of farming and our right relation to the earth, I was invited to come to Kit Kit Kadizzi, Snyder's home in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, to participate in the spring celebration where Buddhist women were going to be present. Women who had taken their vows, women walking the path, bodhisattvas. High in the California mountains, surrounded by manzanita, sleeping under the big open sky, I dreamed that I would find a path of peace, an end to suffering. What most impressed and inspired my then young and innocent mind, far more than the beautiful texts I read, the quiet sitting, the seductive flirtations of male teachers, was the calm, peaceful presence of Buddhist nuns. The young nun I talked with most listened to my story of suffering and shared with me that the path of mindfulness was not for everyone. One had to be ready. Simply longing was not enough. Above all, this transformative encounter compelled me to maintain hope in the face of suffering. Afterwards, whenever I found myself falling into the abyss of despair, contemplating death as an easy way out, I would find myself holding on, clinging to the belief that there could and would be a way out of suffering. As I developed greater critical consciousness through intellectual and academic work, feminist theory and practice enabled me to remain committed to Buddhist practice. In the face of the sexism and patriarchal drama that often depressed my spirit, because it empowered me to work within alternative frameworks, sexism and patriarchy could be observed and critiqued, yet I did not have to become attached to acts of resistance. I could engage in Buddhist practice without subordinating myself to male domination, following in the tradition of women who have opened their hearts to Buddhism without subjugating mind and spirit. Enlightened women found their way to being Buddhas long before patriarchal Buddhism, in organized structures, gave their endorsement and their permission. Sorry, having a hard time. In the West, visionary teachers urge us to move beyond gender, whether we are in a patriarchal framework or a liberatory feminist context, so that our attention can be concentrated on what truly matters. Spiritual practice is what truly matters. While the critique of patriarchy and the revisioning of Buddhist thought and practice so that it is no longer informed by patriarchal bias is a political, ethical, and spiritual struggle that is essential and ongoing, it must never overshadow commitment to Buddhist practice. I think I'll just end it there, but because I think you kind of get the point of what she's saying in that, sorry, it's sort of hard to read because it's so familiar, you know? So I'm so grateful for her. I'm just so grateful for her. I like that she says, enlightened women were becoming Buddhas long before they had permission to do it. Anyway, I think that's really all I have to say. I'm going to end it there.
Please turn to page 12 in the Zendo, page 19 online.
May the merit of this penetrate into each thing in all places, so that we and every sentient being